Petty Officer Second Class Sarah Martinez moved through the ammunition storage compartment with practiced efficiency, her steel-toed boots echoing against the metal deck plates of the USS Gerald R. Ford. The massive aircraft carrier cut through the Pacific waters at 25 knots. But down here in the belly of the ship, the only indication of movement was the subtle vibration that every sailor learned to ignore after their first week aboard. Sarah hefted another 20mm ammunition canister, her lean frame belying the strength required to handle the heavy ordnance. At 26, she had been in the Navy for 8 years, long enough to know every inch of the weapons handling areas, every safety protocol, and every shortcut that could save precious seconds during combat operations. Her dark hair was pulled back in regulation style, and her utilities bore the crisp creases that spoke of military pride. But there was something about the way she carried herself, a careful, measured quality that suggested someone who preferred to remain unnoticed. The morning watch was always quiet in the ammunition storage areas. Most of the air wing personnel were either in their racks, catching sleep between missions, or up on the flight deck preparing for the day's first launch. Sarah preferred these early hours, when she could work methodically through her checklist without the usual chaos that came with flight operations. The ammunition had to be ready, organized, and accounted for before the day's missions began, and she took that responsibility seriously. As she worked, her hand unconsciously moved to her chest, fingers briefly touching something beneath her uniform blouse. The gesture lasted only a moment before she caught herself and returned to her task, but it was a habit she had developed over the past 18 months, a reflexive check to ensure that what she kept hidden remained so. The compartment door opened with a metallic clang, and Seaman Rodriguez stepped inside, carrying a steaming cup of coffee and looking like he needed it desperately. "Morning, Petty Officer Martinez," he said, stifling a yawn. "Ready for another exciting day of moving boom boom around the ship?" Sarah smiled despite herself. Rodriguez was 19, fresh from ammunition handling school, and still possessed the enthusiasm that military service had a way of tempering over time. "Every day's exciting when you're handling enough firepower to level a city block, Rodriguez. Just remember that." "Yes, ma'am. I mean, Petty Officer." Rodriguez set his coffee aside and grabbed a manifest clipboard. "Chief wants the 20 Mike rounds, staged for loading by 0800. Something about the air wing running low after yesterday's training exercises." "Training exercises," Sarah repeated, shaking her head. The term seemed inadequate for what had actually happened the day before. The carrier group had encountered what intelligence later confirmed was a probe by hostile submarines, and several of the A-10 Super Hornets had expended more ammunition than planned during the response. Not enough to constitute combat, but enough to remind everyone that their position in the South China Sea was anything but routine patrol duty. The two sailors worked in comfortable silence for the next hour, moving ammunition canisters, updating inventory sheets, and ensuring that every round was properly secured for transfer to the flight deck. Sarah had trained Rodriguez well over the past 6 months, and he had progressed from nervous recruit to competent ammunition handler. She took quiet pride in that accomplishment, though she would never voice it. Recognition was something she actively avoided. At 0750, they finished staging the ammunition for the first batch of aircraft. Rodriguez wiped sweat from his forehead and checked his watch. "Right on time." "Chief's going to be happy." "Chief's never happy," Sarah replied, but there was affection in her voice. Chief Petty Officer Johnson ran the ammunition division with the kind of exacting standards that kept everyone alive in a job where mistakes were measured in body counts. But he'll be less unhappy than usual. As they secured the compartment for transfer operations, Sarah's fingers once again moved to her chest, that brief, involuntary gesture that had become as natural as breathing. This time, Rodriguez noticed. "You okay, Petty Officer? You keep doing that thing with your shirt." Sarah's hand dropped immediately. "Just checking my name tape. Sometimes the Velcro comes loose in the humidity down here." It was a reasonable explanation, and Rodriguez accepted it without question. The truth was, something Sarah had never spoken aloud to anyone aboard the carrier. Beneath her uniform blouse, hanging on a simple chain around her neck, was a medal that she had never officially received and never wanted anyone to discover. The weight of it was negligible. A few ounces of metal and ribbon. but it felt heavier than any ammunition canister she had ever lifted. The medal was the Navy and Marine Corps Medal, the service's highest non-combat decoration for heroism. It had been presented to her in a private ceremony 18 months ago, following an incident that the Navy preferred to keep quiet. The official citation mentioned her extraordinary heroism and voluntary risk of life during a rescue operation, but the sanitized language could not capture what had actually happened on that night when everything went wrong. Sarah preferred it that way. The last thing she wanted was the attention that came with being known as a hero. Heroes attracted scrutiny, and scrutiny led to expectations she was not sure she could meet again. Better to be Petty Officer Martinez, competent ammunition handler, than to be the sailor who had done something that earned her a medal she could not bring herself to wear openly. The intercom crackled to life with the morning announcement. "Now hear this. Now hear this. All hands prepare for flight quarters. Flight quarters. Flight quarters." The familiar words signaled the beginning of another day of flight operations, the complex dance of launching and recovering aircraft that was the primary mission of any aircraft carrier. Sarah and Rodriguez made their final equipment checks and prepared to move topside to the weapons staging area. As they climbed the ladders toward the flight deck level, Sarah could feel the familiar acceleration of the ship as it turned into the wind for aircraft launch operations. The sound of jet engines spooling up filtered down through the steel structure, a reminder that their work with ammunition was just the beginning of a much larger and more dangerous process. On the hangar deck, the organized chaos of flight operations was already underway. Plane captains performed final checks on their aircraft while ordnance personnel loaded missiles and ammunition into the various weapon systems. The Air Wing's A-10 Super Hornets and F-35C Lightning II fighters gleamed under the fluorescent lights, their weapons pylons waiting to receive the ordnance that Sarah and her team had prepared. As Sarah supervised the loading of 20mm ammunition into the aircraft's internal guns, she noticed increased activity among the senior officers. Captain Reynolds, the ship's commanding officer, was in deep conversation with Commander Hayes from the Air Wing, their body language suggesting that this was more than routine planning. Whatever had them concerned, it was serious enough to bring both men to the hangar deck during critical pre-flight operations. "Heads up," Rodriguez murmured, nodding toward the officers. "Looks like we might be doing more than training exercises today." Sarah followed his gaze and felt a familiar tightness in her chest. The same feeling she had experienced 18 months ago when routine patrol duty had suddenly become something much more dangerous. The same feeling that had led to her receiving a medal she could never acknowledge. She touched her chest again, that unconscious gesture betraying her inner tension. The medal seemed to grow heavier as she watched the officers' urgent conference, and for a moment, she wondered if the time was coming when her desire to remain unnoticed would conflict with her duty to serve. It was a question she hoped she would never have to answer, but as the officers dispersed and new orders began flowing through the chain of command, Sarah had the sinking feeling that her carefully maintained anonymity was about to be tested. The flight deck announcement system came alive with new instructions. "All department heads report to the bridge for immediate briefing. All department heads report to the bridge." The urgency in the communications officer's voice was subtle, but unmistakable to anyone who had served long enough to recognize the difference between routine and crisis. As Sarah continued her work, loading ammunition with the same methodical precision she had demonstrated countless times before, she could not shake the feeling that the careful balance she had maintained for 18 months was about to shift. Somewhere above them, decisions were being made that would affect every person aboard the carrier, and she found herself hoping that whatever was coming would not require the kind of heroism that earned medals, the kind that she had promised herself she would never display again. The weight of the hidden medal against her chest served as a constant reminder of what happened when ordinary sailors were forced to do extraordinary things. And as the USS Gerald R. Ford continued its passage through increasingly troubled waters, Sarah Martinez continued her work, determined to remain just another ammunition handler in a crew of 5,000. Even as circumstances beyond her control began to converge in ways that would soon make that impossible. The morning sun climbed higher over the Pacific, casting long shadows across the flight deck above, while deep in the ship's ammunition spaces, a decorated hero tried desperately to remain invisible. 3 hours after the urgent briefing, Sarah noticed the change in the ship's rhythm. The USS Gerald R. Ford had altered course twice, and the flight operations that should have been routine training missions had taken on the unmistakable characteristics of real-world tasking. Aircraft were being loaded with live ordnance instead of training rounds, and the weapons staging area buzzed with the kind of focused intensity that only came when lives were potentially at stake. Admiral Catherine Reyes arrived aboard the carrier via helicopter at 1,300 hours. Her presence immediately felt throughout the ship, even though most of the crew never saw her. Sarah was in Weapons Storage Compartment 3 when word filtered down through the enlisted ranks that a 2-star admiral was aboard for operational consultations, which was military speak for, "Something significant is happening, and we need senior leadership to make decisions." Admiral Reyes was legendary in the Pacific Fleet, known for her tactical brilliance during the Taiwan crisis 3 years earlier and her ability to see details that others missed. At 52, she had risen through the ranks by combining technical expertise with an intuitive understanding of naval warfare that had earned her the respect of peers and subordinates alike. She also had a reputation for walking the ship during crisis situations, appearing in compartments where admirals typically never ventured, talking to sailors at every level to get a complete picture of the ship's readiness. Sarah was conducting an ammunition count when Chief Johnson appeared in the compartment doorway, his expression more serious than usual. "Martinez, I need you to brief the weapons status to some VIPs in 10 minutes. Clean uniform, by the book, no room for mistakes." "Who am I briefing, Chief?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Admiral Reyes and her staff. They want a complete rundown of our ordnance capabilities and current stores. You know this stuff better than anyone else in the division." Sarah's stomach clenched. She had been successful in avoiding high-visibility assignments for 18 months, always managing to direct attention to other qualified personnel when opportunities for recognition arose. But when an admiral specifically requested a briefing from the ammunition division, there was no way to remain invisible. "Can't Petty Officer Stevens handle it? He's senior to me. Stevens is in sickbay with food poisoning. You're up, Martinez." And Sarah? Chief Johnson's use of her first name was rare enough to get her attention. "This isn't the time to be modest. The Admiral needs accurate information to make decisions that could affect this entire battle group. Do your job." 20 minutes later, Sarah found herself in the Weapons Control Center, standing before a table where Admiral Reyes and 3 other senior officers were studying tactical displays and intelligence reports. The Admiral was smaller than Sarah had expected, but she radiated the kind of quiet authority that made her presence fill the entire compartment. "Petty Officer Martinez?" Admiral Reyes said without looking up from her papers. "I understand you're the subject matter expert on our ammunition status." "Yes, ma'am." Sarah's voice was steady despite her nervousness. "I have the current inventory reports for all ordnance types. Before we get to the numbers, tell me about our ammunition handling capabilities. If we needed to conduct sustained operations for 72 hours, what would be our limiting factors?" It was the kind of question that required more than just reading from reports. Sarah took a breath and began explaining the complex logistics of ammunition movement, the personnel requirements for different types of ordnance, and the potential bottlenecks that could develop during extended combat operations. As she spoke, she noticed Admiral Reyes watching her intently, not just listening to her words but observing her delivery, her confidence, and her depth of knowledge. "Your assessment of our 20mm ammunition is particularly concerning," the Admiral said when Sarah finished. "You mentioned potential supply chain issues. Elaborate on that." Sarah explained the technical challenges of manufacturing 20mm rounds to Navy specifications, the limited number of suppliers, and the time required to transport ammunition to forward-deployed ships. As she spoke about logistics and supply considerations, she found herself relaxing slightly. This was technical information, the kind of briefing that focused on facts rather than personalities. "Excellent analysis," Admiral Reyes said. "Now, I have a hypothetical scenario for you. Suppose we had to defend this battle group against a coordinated attack involving both air and surface threats. What would be your recommended ammunition distribution to maximize our defensive capabilities?" The question was clearly not hypothetical, and Sarah realized she was being asked to provide tactical input that would influence actual operational decisions. She outlined her recommendations, discussing the optimal mix of air-to-air missiles, surface attack munitions, and defensive ammunition for the ship's close-in weapon systems. Her suggestions were based on years of experience and training, but also on something deeper. An intuitive understanding of naval combat that came from having been tested in real situations. As Sarah spoke, Admiral Reyes continued to study her with an attention that made her increasingly uncomfortable. There was something in the Admiral's expression that suggested recognition, though Sarah was certain they had never met. When she finished her briefing, the Admiral thanked her and dismissed her. But Sarah could feel those sharp eyes following her as she left the compartment. 2 hours later, Sarah was back in the ammunition storage areas when Rodriguez found her with disturbing news. "Petty officer, something weird just happened. Some guy in a dress uniform came looking for you, said he was from the Admiral's staff, and wanted to verify some personnel information." Sarah's heart rate spiked. "What kind of personnel information? Your service record, previous duty assignments, stuff like that. I told him you were busy with weapons loading, but he said he'd be back." Rodriguez paused, studying Sarah's expression. "Everything okay? You look like you saw a ghost." Before Sarah could answer, the compartment door opened again, and Yeoman First Class Thompson from the ship's administration office stepped inside. Thompson was holding a tablet and wearing the expression of someone who had been tasked with something he did not quite understand. "Petty Officer Martinez? Admiral Reyes requests that you report to her quarters at 1800 hours. Dress blue uniform." Thompson consulted his tablet. "She also requested that you bring any personal awards or commendations that might not be reflected in your official service record." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Rodriguez looked confused. But Thompson's expression suggested he was merely delivering a message without understanding its significance. Sarah managed to maintain her composure long enough to acknowledge the order and dismiss both sailors. But once she was alone, she sat heavily on an ammunition crate and tried to steady her breathing. Admiral Reyes knew. Somehow, despite all of Sarah's efforts to keep her past buried, the Admiral had figured it out. The careful attention during the briefing, the questions about her background, the request for information about awards, it all pointed to one conclusion. Sarah's 18-month effort to remain invisible was about to end. The Navy and Marine Corps medal hanging around her neck felt like it weighed 100 pounds. She pulled it out from beneath her uniform and looked at it for the first time in months. The bronze medal depicted an eagle perched on an anchor, surrounded by a circle of 13 stars. The ribbon was navy blue with thin yellow and red stripes, colors that she had once worn with pride but now saw as a beacon drawing unwanted attention. The citation that came with the medal was burned into her memory, even though she had never read it aloud to anyone. "For extraordinary heroism and voluntary risk of life, above and beyond the call of duty during rescue operations following the catastrophic explosion aboard the USS Milwaukee on 15 March 2023, Petty Officer Martinez, without regard for her own safety, repeatedly entered smoke-filled compartments to rescue injured personnel, saving 17 lives before the compartment was fully evacuated. Her actions reflected great credit upon herself and the United States Navy. What the citation did not mention was that Sarah had been off duty when the explosion occurred, had no specific rescue training, and had been ordered by senior personnel to remain clear of the damaged areas. What it did not capture was the terror she felt as she crawled through twisted metal and toxic smoke, or the nightmares that followed for months afterward. And what it certainly did not convey was her absolute certainty that she never wanted to be in a situation where such heroism was required again. The medal represented everything Sarah wanted to forget about herself. The tendency to act without considering consequences. The inability to ignore others' suffering even when prudence demanded it, and the willingness to risk everything for people she barely knew. She had accepted the medal because refusing it would have caused more attention than accepting it. But she had never worn it publicly, and had hoped that by keeping it hidden, she could somehow avoid becoming the person who had earned it. Sarah spent the next 2 hours completing her ammunition duties while wrestling with what she would tell Admiral Reyes. The truth seemed both inevitable and impossible. She could not lie to a flag officer, but she also could not bear the thought of being seen as someone special. Someone who might be expected to perform heroics again when circumstances demanded it. As 1,800 hours approached, Sarah changed into her dress blue uniform in the small compartment she shared with 3 other petty officers. The navy blue jumper and white shirt felt foreign after months of working in utilities, but it was the weight of the metal that bothered her most. She could leave it hidden, but Admiral Reyes had specifically requested any awards not reflected in her official record. Disobeying a direct order from a flag officer was not an option. At exactly 1,800, Sarah knocked on the door to Admiral Reyes's quarters. The compartment was larger than any space she had seen on the ship, but still modest by civilian standards. The Admiral was seated behind a small desk, still wearing her working uniform, and she gestured for Sarah to take the single chair across from her. "Petty Officer Martinez, thank you for coming. Before we begin, I want you to know that this conversation is entirely off the record. Nothing you say here will appear in any official documentation unless you specifically request it." Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. "I've been reviewing your service record, and I find it interesting that someone with your obvious capabilities has managed to avoid any significant recognition for the past 18 months. In fact, your record is almost suspiciously ordinary for someone with your demonstrated expertise." Admiral Reyes leaned back in her chair, her expression patient but determined. "I also find it interesting that your previous commanding officer, Captain Morrison, refused to discuss your performance aboard the USS Milwaukee, beyond saying that you were an outstanding sailor who deserves privacy. That kind of protective language usually indicates something significant or happened." Sarah remained silent, but she could feel the weight of the hidden metal as if it were broadcasting its presence. "So," Admiral Reyes continued, "I'm going to ask you directly. Is there something in your background that would help me understand why the most knowledgeable ammunition technician in this battle group has been working so hard to remain invisible?" Admiral Reyes examined the Navy and Marine Corps medal with the reverence it deserved, turning it over in her hands to read the inscription on the back. When she looked up, her expression had softened, but her eyes remained intent. "March 15th, 2023, she said quietly. "The USS Milwaukee's ammunition storage explosion. I remember reading the initial incident reports. 17 sailors rescued from compartments that should have been impossible to enter safely." She handed the medal back to Sarah. "What I didn't know was who had done the rescuing." Sarah accepted the medal but did not put it away. "I was hoping no one would ever have to know, ma'am." "Tell me what happened that night." For 18 months, Sarah had avoided speaking about the Milwaukee incident to anyone. She had undergone mandatory counseling sessions where she provided clinical descriptions of events, answered investigators' questions with precise technical details, and accepted the medal in a private ceremony where she spoke only when required to acknowledge the honor. But she had never actually told the story. Not in a way that conveyed the terror, the desperation, and the impossible choices that had defined those 47 minutes of her life. "There was no warning," Sarah began, her voice barely above a whisper. "One moment I was in my rack reading, and the next moment the ship was shaking like it was coming apart. The explosion happened in ammunition storage compartment 7, right below the berthing area, where most of the off-duty weapons personnel were sleeping." Admiral Reyes listened without interruption as Sarah described the chaos that followed. Emergency lighting, smoke-filled passageways, and the awful realization that 17 people were trapped in compartments where the normal escape routes had been blocked by twisted metal and debris. Damage control teams were focused on preventing secondary explosions and maintaining the ship's stability, but the trapped personnel were in spaces that the emergency responders could not safely access. The senior chief ordered everyone to stay clear while they figured out a safe way to conduct rescue operations, Sarah continued. "But I knew those compartments better than anyone else. I had been working in ammunition storage for 3 years, and I knew every access panel, every maintenance crawlway, every structural weak point that could be exploited." "So you disobeyed the order to stay clear?" "Yes, ma'am. I found a route through the ventilation system that led to the damaged compartments. It was barely wide enough for a person, filled with smoke, and structurally unsound, but it was the only way to reach the trapped sailors before the compartment flooded or suffered secondary explosions." Sarah described crawling through spaces never meant for human passage, guided only by emergency lighting and the voices of trapped personnel calling for help. She made 17 trips through that route, each time pulling an unconscious or injured sailor to safety. Each time knowing that the next trip might be her last, as the damaged structure continued to deteriorate around her. The worst part wasn't the physical danger, Sarah said, her voice growing steadier as she spoke. It was having to choose who to rescue first, based on who had the best chance of survival. Medical triage in a combat zone, except it was my shipmates, people I ate meals with and worked alongside every day. Admiral Reyes remained silent for several moments after Sarah finished. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had made life and death decisions throughout her career. Petty Officer Martinez, you saved 17 lives through extraordinary courage and technical expertise. Why does that feel like a burden to you instead of an accomplishment? The question struck at the heart of what Sarah had been struggling with for 18 months. Because I can't do it again, ma'am. People look at that medal, and they expect me to be someone who can handle impossible situations, who can make those kinds of decisions under pressure. But I was terrified the entire time. I almost got everyone killed, including myself, because I couldn't think clearly, couldn't make good decisions. I got lucky. Not heroic. Sarah, Admiral Reyes said, using her first name deliberately, I've been in combat situations where split-second decisions determined whether people lived or died. The fact that you were terrified doesn't diminish what you accomplished. The fact that you thought you were making bad decisions doesn't change the fact that 17 families got their loved ones back because of your actions. Before Sarah could respond, Admiral Reyes's secure communication device beeped with an urgent message. The Admiral read the display, and her expression immediately became grim. We need to continue this conversation, but circumstances have just changed dramatically. Admiral Reyes stood and moved to her secure terminal. 3 hours ago, a Chinese submarine launched torpedoes at a Philippines patrol vessel 80 miles from our current position. The patrol vessel is dead in the water with significant casualties, and our battle group has been ordered to provide immediate assistance. Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest as Admiral Reyes continued the briefing. The problem is that the submarine is still in the area, possibly waiting for us to respond so they can engage our ships. We need to conduct rescue operations while maintaining defensive posture, which means we need maximum ammunition readiness for sustained combat operations. Ma'am, our ammunition status is solid for normal operations, but if you're talking about simultaneous rescue operations and anti-submarine warfare, we'll need to reconfigure our entire weapons loadout in under 6 hours. Exactly. And according to your brief this afternoon, you're the only person aboard this ship who has both the technical expertise and the operational experience to manage that kind of complex ammunition redistribution under combat conditions. Sarah realized where this conversation was heading, and she felt the same sick feeling in her stomach that she had experienced 18 months ago when she first heard the voices of trapped sailors calling for help. Ma'am, I can provide technical guidance to Chief Johnson and the senior ammunition personnel. No, Admiral Reyes interrupted. I need someone who can make decisions in real time. Someone who understands both the technical requirements and the operational implications. Someone who has proven they can function under extreme pressure when lives are at stake. The Admiral moved closer to Sarah, her expression both understanding and determined. I know you don't want this responsibility. I know you'd rather remain invisible and let someone else make the hard decisions, but we don't always get to choose when our capabilities are needed. Sarah looked down at the medal still clutched in her hands. The bronze felt warm from her touch, and for the first time in 18 months, she allowed herself to remember not just the terror of that night aboard the Milwaukee, but also the satisfaction of hearing 17 voices answer when roll call was taken after the rescue. 17 people who went home to their families because she had been willing to act when action was needed. What exactly are you asking me to do, ma'am? I'm asking you to take charge of ammunition operations for the next 72 hours. I'm asking you to coordinate weapons loading and distribution for both rescue operations and potential combat. And I'm asking you to accept a temporary promotion to Chief Petty Officer. So you'll have the authority to make those decisions without going through multiple levels of approval. The offer was extraordinary. A battlefield promotion 2 ranks above her current position, authority over operations that would normally require years more experience, and responsibility for decisions that could affect the safety of the entire battle group. It was also exactly what Sarah had been trying to avoid for 18 months. "Admiral, I appreciate your confidence. But, Sarah..." "Stop," Admiral Reyes said firmly. "I'm not asking you to be fearless. I'm asking you to be competent, which you've already proven you are. I'm not asking you to enjoy this responsibility. I'm asking you to accept it because you're the best person for the job." Sarah thought about the Philippines patrol vessel dead in the water somewhere ahead of them, about sailors who might be trapped or injured, about the complex decision matrix required to balance rescue operations with defensive preparations. She thought about the Chinese submarine that might be waiting to attack any ship that responded to the distress call. And she thought about Admiral Reyes, whose experience and judgment had identified Sarah as the person best qualified to handle an impossible situation. "If I accept this," Sarah said slowly, "I want Rodriguez promoted to Petty Officer 3rd Class to serve as my assistant. And I want Chief Johnson to remain as senior advisor. I'll need people I trust for this to work." Admiral Reyes smiled for the first time since Sarah had entered the compartment. "Done. Anything else?" Sarah stood up and carefully placed the Navy and Marine Corps medal around her neck, letting it rest openly against her dress blue jumper for the first time in 18 months. The weight of it no longer felt like a burden, but like a reminder of what was possible when training, courage, and necessity converged. "I'll need direct communication access to the bridge, engineering, and the air wing commander. If I'm coordinating ammunition for simultaneous operations, I can't wait for messages to filter through normal channels." "You'll have it." Admiral Reyes extended her hand. "Chief Martinez, welcome to the job you've been running from for the past 18 months. As they shook hands, Sarah felt something shift inside her. The terror was still there. It probably always would be. But alongside it was a growing sense of purpose. She had spent 18 months trying to hide from the person who had earned the medal around her neck, but that person was exactly who the situation demanded. "Admiral, request permission to return to my division and begin ammunition reconfiguration." Permission granted. "And Sarah? The next 72 hours are going to test every person aboard this ship. I'm counting on you to ensure we have the firepower to handle whatever we encounter." 6 hours later, as the USS Gerald R. Ford approached the coordinates where the Philippines patrol vessel waited for rescue, Chief Petty Officer Sarah Martinez stood in the Ammunition Control Center, coordinating the complex ballet of weapons loading that would allow the carrier to simultaneously conduct rescue operations and maintain defensive readiness. The Navy and Marine Corps medal hung proudly on her uniform, visible to every sailor under her command. And for the first time in 18 months, she was not afraid of the attention it drew. Around her, ammunition technicians worked with the precision and urgency that came from knowing their work would directly impact the survival of both rescued and rescuer. Rodriguez, now wearing the crow of a third-class petty officer, managed logistics with newfound authority, while Chief Johnson provided the steady guidance that kept complex operations running smoothly. As the first rescue helicopters launched into the darkness toward the disabled patrol vessel, Sarah allowed herself a moment of quiet pride. She had not chosen to be a hero, and she still did not think of herself as one, but she was finally ready to be the person that circumstances demanded. Someone willing to accept responsibility, make hard decisions, and risk everything when lives were at stake. The USS Gerald R. Ford continued its passage through dangerous waters, and in its ammunition control center, a decorated sailor who had tried to hide her heroism had finally learned to embrace it. The question hung in the air between them, and Sarah realized that her 18-month effort to escape her past had finally come to an end. The Admiral was not going to accept evasion. 28 minutes later, Major Sarah Chen was strapped into the cockpit of her A-10, running through final engine start procedures. The twin General Electric TF-34 engines spooled up with their characteristic whistle, building to a steady roar that vibrated through the airframe. Behind her, the 4 SEALs were secured in temporary passenger seats that had been installed in place of some of the aircraft's armor plating. Kandahar Tower, Viper 11 requesting taxi clearance for departure. Sarah transmitted over the radio. Viper 11. Kandahar Tower. Taxi to runway 23. Via taxiway Alpha. Winds 240 at 12 knots. Altimeter 2992. Sarah acknowledged the clearance and began taxiing toward the runway. The A-10 moved with characteristic deliberation, its tricycle landing gear absorbing the bumps and irregularities of the taxiway. Through her headset, she could hear the SEALs conducting final communications checks on their equipment. "Viper, this is Frost," came Morrison's voice over the intercom. "My team's ready back here. How's the aircraft looking?" "All systems green," Sarah replied, her eyes scanning the instrument panel. "Engine temps normal, hydraulics good, flight controls responding properly. We're looking good for departure." As they approached the runway, Sarah completed her final control checks. The A-10's flight controls were fully manual, with no fly-by-wire computers to smooth out pilot inputs or prevent aggressive maneuvering. This was both an advantage and a challenge for the mission ahead. The direct control connection would allow her to feel exactly what the aircraft was doing, but it also meant that every control input had to be precise. Kandahar Tower, Viper 11, ready for departure. Viper 11, cleared for takeoff runway 2-3. Contact departure control on frequency 25.4.7 after airborne. Sarah lined up on the center line and advanced the throttles. The twin engines responded immediately, pushing the heavily loaded aircraft forward with increasing speed. At 138 knots, she rotated the nose wheel off the ground, and the A-10 lifted into the morning sky. "Positive rate of climb. Gear up," she called out, retracting the landing gear. Kandahar departure. Viper 1 airborne off runway 2-3. Climbing to flight level 150. Viper 11, radar contact. Climb and maintain flight level 150. Proceed direct to waypoint Alpha. The flight to the mountains would take 45 minutes at normal cruise altitude. Sarah used this time to review the mission profile one more time and to give the SEALs a better understanding of what they would experience during the low-level portion of the flight. Frost. "Once we begin our descent for the mountain approach, things are going to get interesting," Sarah transmitted over the intercom. "We'll be pulling some significant G-forces during the maneuvering, and the ride will be much rougher than what you're used to in helicopters." "Copy that, Viper," Morrison replied. "We've all been through high-G training. What should we expect specifically? During the tightest turns, we might see up to 3 Gs. That's going to press you back into your seats pretty hard. More importantly, we'll be experiencing a lot of turbulence from flying so close to the ground. Mountain terrain creates unpredictable air currents, so expect some bumps." Rodriguez's voice came through the intercom. "How close to the ground are we actually going to be?" At the lowest point, we'll be about 75 feet above ground level. For reference, that's roughly the height of a 7-story building. At our cruise speed of 350 knots, we'll be covering about 590 feet per second. So the margin for error is extremely small. Tank's voice carried a note of disbelief. "Jesus, Major. That's like flying through a parking garage at highway speeds." Sarah had to admit the comparison was apt. "That's actually not a bad analogy. The difference is that this parking garage is carved out of solid rock, and there's no room to swerve if you misjudge your approach." As they approached the mountains, Sarah could see the massive peaks rising ahead of them. The Hindu Kush Range stretched across the horizon, its snow-capped summits gleaming in the morning sun. From their current altitude of 15,000 feet, the mountains looked almost peaceful, like a postcard photograph of natural beauty. "Beginning descent in 2 minutes, Sarah announced. "Everyone make sure you're strapped in tight." She reduced power and began a controlled descent toward the entry point for Pass Alpha. As they descended, the mountains seemed to grow larger and more imposing. The peaceful postcard view was replaced by a sobering reality of massive stone walls and narrow passages that looked barely wide enough for the aircraft. At 5,000 feet above sea level, Sarah leveled off and began flying toward the entrance to Pass Alpha. The pass appeared as a narrow cut between 2 towering peaks, dark and forbidding against the morning sky. "Entering the mountains in 30 seconds, Sarah announced. "Here we go. Here we go." She reduced power further and lowered the aircraft's nose, beginning the transition to low-level flight. The ground rushed up to meet them with startling speed. At 500 feet above ground level, the sensation of speed became dramatically more pronounced. At 200 feet, it was like riding a rocket through a landscape of stone and ice. "Holy shit," came Tank's voice over the intercom, followed immediately by an apology for the language. Sarah was too focused on flying to respond to the comment. The entrance to Pass Alpha was approaching rapidly, and she needed to line up perfectly for the run through the narrow passage. She made a slight correction to the left, using gentle control inputs to position the aircraft precisely in the center of the pass. The walls of the pass rose on either side of them like the ramparts of some ancient fortress. Sarah could see the rocky terrain streaming past the cockpit windows at incredible speed. The sensation was unlike anything she had experienced before, even during her most aggressive training flights. "Pass Alpha, entering now," she reported, her voice calm and professional despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. The pass was even narrower than it had appeared on the maps. The walls seemed close enough to touch, though Sarah knew they were actually several hundred feet away on each side. The key was maintaining precise heading control while dealing with the unpredictable air currents created by the mountain terrain. Halfway through the pass, Sarah encountered her first real challenge. A downdraft caught the aircraft, pushing it toward the floor of the pass. She immediately added power and pulled back on the stick, fighting to maintain altitude. The A-10 responded sluggishly in the thin air at 8,000 feet above sea level, but it responded. "Slight turbulence there," Sarah explained to the SEALs. "Mountain flying is all about energy management. We need enough speed to maintain control authority, but not so much that we can't react to obstacles or wind shear." As they exited Pass Alpha, Sarah immediately began setting up for the approach to Pass Bravo. This pass was wider, but had a sharp bend that would require precise navigation. She banked the aircraft into a gentle left turn, using the terrain features as reference points to maintain the correct flight path. "Beginning turn for Pass Bravo," Sarah announced. "This one has a dog leg in the middle, so we'll be changing direction while maintaining low altitude." The entrance to Pass Bravo was deceptive. What looked like a straight shot from a distance revealed itself to be a complex series of turns and elevation changes. Sarah adjusted her approach speed, slowing the aircraft slightly to give herself more time to react to the changing terrain. Entering the pass, Sarah immediately noticed that the air was rougher here than in Pass Alpha. The walls were more irregular, creating complex wind patterns that buffeted the aircraft. She found herself making constant small corrections to maintain altitude and heading. "Viper, how are you doing up there?" Morrison asked, his voice tight with concentration. "Good so far," Sarah replied, her hands moving constantly on the controls. "The aircraft's performing exactly as expected. We're about to hit the turn in the pass." The dogleg turn appeared ahead of them, a sharp bend to the right that required a 30-degree heading change while maintaining precise altitude control. Sarah banked the aircraft into the turn, feeling the G-forces press her into her seat. Behind her, she could hear one of the SEALs grunt with the effort of breathing under the increased gravitational load. 3 Gs, she announced, monitoring the G-meter on her instrument panel. "This is the steepest turn we'll encounter." The turn seemed to go on forever, though Sarah knew from her flight plan that it lasted only about 15 seconds. As they rolled out of the turn, the exit from Pass Bravo came into view ahead of them. Sarah breathed a small sigh of relief as they cleared the pass without incident. 2 down, 1 to go, she told the SEALs. "Pass Charlie coming up. This is the challenging one." Pass Charlie was indeed the most demanding part of the entire route. The approach required a descending turn that would take them from 200 feet above ground level down to 75 feet, while simultaneously making a 45-degree course change. The margins for error were essentially zero. Sarah began setting up for the approach to Pass Charlie while they were still 2 miles away. She reduced power and adjusted the aircraft's trim, preparing for the complex maneuvering ahead. Through the windscreen, she could see the narrow entrance to the pass, barely visible between the towering peaks. "Beginning approach to Pass Charlie," Sarah announced. "This is going to be the roughest part of the ride. The pass requires us to descend while turning, so we'll be pulling some serious Gs while dealing with terrain-induced turbulence." She lined up for the approach, checking her airspeed and altitude one more time. Everything had to be perfect for this to work. Too fast, and she wouldn't be able to make the turn. Too slow, and the aircraft would lose lift and sink into the mountainside. Charlie, approach. Beginning now, Sarah transmitted, beginning her descent into the pass. The walls of Pass Charlie seemed to close in around them, like the jaws of some enormous predator. Sarah immediately encountered severe turbulence as the irregular canyon walls created chaotic wind patterns. The aircraft bucked and pitched like an angry bronco, but Sarah's control inputs remained smooth and precise. Jesus, Rodriguez muttered over the intercom. It's like flying through a blender. Sarah was too focused to respond. The critical turn was approaching, and she needed to begin her descent while simultaneously banking the aircraft to the right. She reduced power and lowered the nose, feeling the ground rushing up to meet them at an alarming rate. The turn began gradually, but the confined space of the pass made it feel much more aggressive. Sarah pulled the aircraft through the turn while simultaneously managing the descent, her eyes moving constantly between the instrument panel and the terrain ahead. The canyon walls were so close now that she could see individual rocks and crevices in the stone. At the steepest part of the turn, the aircraft was pulling nearly 4 Gs. Sarah felt the crushing weight pressing her into her seat, making it difficult to breathe. Behind her, she could hear the seals grunting with the effort of maintaining consciousness under the extreme gravitational forces. 4 Gs, Sarah announced through gritted teeth. Almost through the turn, the exit from Pass Charlie appeared ahead of them, opening into the target valley like the mouth of a cave emerging into daylight. Sarah rolled the aircraft level and pulled back slightly on the stick, leveling off at exactly 75 feet above the valley floor. Valley floor, 75 feet, Sarah announced triumphantly. We're in. Behind her, she could hear the SEALs letting out collective sighs of relief and amazement. They had just completed what many pilots would consider an impossible flight, threading a 30,000-pound aircraft through mountain passes that barely provided clearance for the wingspan. Viper, that was incredible, Morrison said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. I've never experienced anything like that. Tank's voice came through the intercom next. Major, I take back everything I said about this being impossible. You just flew us through terrain that I wouldn't want to walk through, let alone fly through. Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction at the recognition from these elite warriors. These were men who had seen combat in the world's most dangerous places, who had pushed themselves and their equipment to the absolute limits of human performance. Their respect was not given lightly. Thank you, gentlemen, Sarah replied. But we're not done yet. Now we need to find your landing zone and get you on the ground safely. The target valley was about 12 miles long and 3 miles wide, surrounded by peaks that rose to over 14,000 feet. According to the mission briefing, the Taliban had observation posts on several of the surrounding ridgelines, but their low-altitude approach had kept them below the line of sight from those positions. Sarah began a systematic search of the valley floor, looking for the designated landing zone. The LZ was supposed to be marked by a cluster of large boulders, arranged in a specific pattern, but from 75 feet above ground level, everything looked like rocks and scrub vegetation. LZ should be about 2 clicks north of our current position, Rodriguez reported, consulting his GPS device. Bearing 015 degrees from here, my. Sarah adjusted her heading and began flying toward the indicated position. As they approached the area, she spotted the boulder formation that marked the landing zone. The LZ was smaller than she had expected, barely large enough for the A-10 to land and take off safely. There's your LZ, Sarah announced, circling the area at low altitude. It's going to be tight, but we can make it work. She began setting up for the approach, extending the landing gear and configuring the aircraft for landing. The A-10 was designed for operations from rough, unimproved airstrips, but this would be pushing the envelope even for the rugged Warthog. Gear down, flaps set for landing, Sarah announced. Beginning final approach. The approach to the makeshift landing zone required careful energy management. Sarah needed to bring the aircraft in slowly enough to land safely on the short strip, but fast enough to maintain control authority in the thin mountain air. As they touched down on the rocky valley floor, Sarah applied the brakes aggressively, bringing the aircraft to a stop within the available space. Dust and debris kicked up by the aircraft's engines created a brown cloud that obscured visibility for several moments. Welcome to Afghanistan, gentlemen, Sarah announced as she shut down the engines. Please watch your step on the way out. The SEALs quickly gathered their gear and prepared to disembark. As they moved toward the aircraft's emergency exit, Morrison paused and looked forward toward the cockpit. Major Chen, he said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet after engine shutdown. What you just did was the most impressive piece of flying I've ever witnessed. When we get back to base, I'm putting you in for a commendation. Rodriguez nodded in agreement. Ma'am, I've flown with some of the best pilots in the military. What you just accomplished puts you in a very exclusive club. Even Tank, who had been the most skeptical about her abilities, offered his respect. Major, you've got skills that would make a test pilot jealous. I'm honored to have flown with you. 6 hours later, Sarah sat in the cockpit of her A-10, engines idling quietly as she waited for the SEALs to return from their mission. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley floor, and the temperature had climbed significantly since their morning arrival. The thin mountain air made the engines run hotter than normal, requiring careful monitoring of engine temperatures. Through her radio headset, she could hear fragments of communication from the SEAL team as they moved through the valley conducting their operations. The mission was classified, but from what she could gather, they were gathering intelligence on enemy positions and movement patterns in the region. Viper, this is Frost. Morrison's voice crackled through the radio. We're about 30 minutes out from the LZ. How's the aircraft looking? Sarah scanned her instrument panel, checking all systems. Aircraft's in good shape, Frost. Engines are running a little warm in this altitude and temperature, but well within acceptable limits. Weather's holding steady. Winds light and variable. Copy that. We've got some interesting intelligence to report when we get back. This valley has been more active than command thought. The comment made Sarah more alert. If the enemy was more active in the area than expected, it could mean their departure would be more dangerous than their arrival. She began reviewing contingency plans for emergency departure procedures. 25 minutes later, Sarah spotted 4 figures moving across the valley floor toward the landing zone. Even from a distance, she could recognize the distinctive movement pattern of the SEALs, moving tactically from cover to cover as they approached the aircraft. Visual contact with your team, Sarah transmitted. Beginning engine start sequence now. She ran through the engine start checklist, bringing both turbofan engines up to idle power. The familiar whine and rumble of the TF-34 engines filled the cockpit as she prepared for immediate departure. In hostile territory, the goal was to minimize time on the ground. The SEALs reached the aircraft and quickly climbed aboard, stowing their gear with practiced efficiency. Within 3 minutes of their arrival, Morrison's voice came through the intercom. Viper, we're secure back here and ready for immediate departure. Recommend we get airborne as soon as possible. Copy that, Frost. Any particular reason for the urgency? We spotted several enemy patrols moving in this direction. Nothing immediate, but I'd rather not test their reaction time. Sarah needed no further encouragement. She advanced the throttles and began her takeoff roll down the improvised runway. The A-10 lifted off the rocky surface after a surprisingly short ground roll, climbing rapidly away from the valley floor. As they climbed toward the entrance to pass Charlie, Sarah noticed something that made her stomach tighten with concern. A layer of clouds had moved into the mountains while they had been on the ground, partially obscuring the peaks and filling some of the lower passes with thick, gray mist. Gentlemen, we've got some weather to deal with on the return trip, Sarah announced over the intercom. Clouds have moved in while we were on the ground. Some of the passes may have reduced visibility. Rodriguez's voice came back immediately. How reduced are we talking about? Sarah studied the approaching clouds, trying to gauge their density and extent. Hard to tell from here, but it looks like we might be flying through some fairly thick stuff. Visibility could be down to a quarter mile or less in the worst areas. Can we go around? Tank asked. Maybe climb over the clouds? Negative, Sarah replied. The clouds extend up to about 18,000 feet, and the peaks go up to over 14,000. We'd have to climb to at least 20,000 feet to get over everything, and that would put us well within range of enemy radar and surface-to-air missiles. she was faced with a challenging decision. The return flight would require navigating the same narrow mountain passes they had flown through that morning. But now, with significantly reduced visibility, flying through clouds at low altitude was inherently dangerous, especially in mountainous terrain where the margin for error was already minimal. "What are our options?" Morrison asked, his voice reflecting the gravity of the situation. "We can wait for the weather to clear, but that could take hours and would leave us exposed on the ground. Or we can fly the route as planned, using instruments and terrain-following radar to navigate through the clouds." Sarah paused, considering the implications of each option. "The A-10 has excellent terrain-following radar and ground proximity warning systems. I can fly the route on instruments, but it's going to be challenging." "Your call, Major," Morrison said. "You're the pilot. We trust your judgment." The weight of responsibility settled heavily on Sarah's shoulders. These men were trusting her with their lives, counting on her skills and judgment to get them home safely. The safe choice would be to wait for better weather, but that carried its own risks. "We're going for it," Sarah decided. "The aircraft systems can handle it, and I'd rather deal with weather than enemy patrols on the ground." She began configuring the aircraft's navigation systems for instrument flight, programming the GPS waypoints for each pass, and setting up the terrain-following radar for maximum resolution. The return route would reverse their morning flight path, taking them through Pass Charlie first, then Bravo, and finally Alpha. "Beginning approach to Pass Charlie," Sarah announced as they approached the cloud-covered entrance to the most difficult pass. "Visibility's about to get very interesting." The aircraft plunged into the clouds like a submarine diving beneath the surface of the ocean. Instantly, the world outside the cockpit windows disappeared, replaced by a gray, featureless void that completely obscured the surrounding terrain. Sarah immediately transitioned to instrument flight, her eyes moving in a practiced pattern across the instrument panel. The attitude indicator showed the aircraft's orientation. The altimeter displayed their height above sea level, and the GPS provided precise navigation information. Most importantly, the terrain-following radar painted a real-time picture of the ground and obstacles ahead of them. "In the soup now," Sarah reported, using pilot slang for flying in clouds. "Terrain radar is painting the pass walls clearly. We're right on course and altitude." Flying on instruments through the narrow mountain pass required absolute precision and unwavering confidence in the aircraft's systems. Sarah could not see the canyon walls that she knew were only a few hundred feet away on either side, but the radar showed them clearly as bright green lines on her display. The first challenge came halfway through Pass Charlie, where the descending turn had been so demanding during their morning flight. Now, flying entirely on instruments, Sarah had to execute the same maneuver without any visual reference to the surrounding terrain. "Beginning the turn and descent," Sarah announced, her voice steady despite the stress of the situation. 4Gs coming up." She banked the aircraft into the turn while simultaneously reducing altitude, using the radar display and GPS navigation to guide her through the complex maneuver. The sensation was surreal, pulling heavy G-forces while flying through a gray void with no visual references except the glowing instruments in front of her. "Still can't see anything out there," Tank observed, his voice tight with tension. "Don't need to," Sarah replied with confidence that surprised even her. "The radar sees everything. We're exactly where we need to be." As they emerged from Pass Charlie into the connecting valley, the clouds thinned slightly, providing occasional glimpses of the rocky terrain below. Sarah used these brief moments of visibility to verify her position and confirm the accuracy of her instruments. "Pass Charlie complete," Sarah announced. "Setting up for Pass Bravo." The approach to Pass Bravo was complicated by shifting cloud density that reduced visibility to near zero at times, then suddenly improved to several hundred feet. Sarah found herself constantly adjusting her scan pattern between outside visual references and instrument indications. "Visibility's variable here," Sarah reported. "Sometimes I can see the pass walls, sometimes I can't. Relying primarily on instruments with visual confirmation when available." Today, the dogleg turn in Pass Bravo proved to be the most challenging part of the entire return flight. As Sarah entered the turn, the clouds suddenly thickened, reducing visibility to absolute zero just as she needed to execute the 30-degree course change. Lost visual completely, Sarah announced, her hands moving smoothly on the controls despite the stress. Going full instruments for the turn. Do. She flew the turn entirely by reference to her instruments, trusting the GPS navigation and terrain radar to guide her through the narrow passage. The sensation was like flying blindfolded through a maze, relying entirely on electronic eyes to avoid the stone walls that surrounded them. As they rolled out of the turn, the clouds began to thin again, and Sarah caught a glimpse of the pass exit ahead of them. The sight of clear sky beyond the clouds was like seeing daylight after hours in a cave. Pass Bravo complete, Sarah announced, relief evident in her voice despite her professional demeanor. One more to go. Pass Alpha, the final obstacle between them and open sky, proved to be the clearest of the 3 passes on the return flight. The clouds were higher here, providing reasonable visibility most of the way through the passage. Good visibility for Pass Alpha, Sarah reported. I can see the walls clearly on both sides. The straight-shot nature of Pass Alpha made it relatively simple compared to the complex maneuvering required for the other 2 passes. Sarah maintained precise altitude and heading control as they flew through the final narrow passage between the towering peaks. Clear of the mountains, Sarah announced as they emerged from Pass Alpha into open sky. We're home free. We're... Behind her, she could hear the SEALs letting out collective sighs of relief. The return flight had been even more challenging than the morning approach, testing both the aircraft's capabilities and Sarah's skills to their absolute limits. Viper, that was incredible, Morrison said, his voice filled with admiration. Flying through those passes in weather conditions that would ground most aircraft. I've never seen anything like it. Morrison, the aircraft performed flawlessly, Sarah replied. These systems are designed for exactly this type of mission. The radar and navigation equipment made it possible. Rodriguez's voice came through the intercom. Major, don't be modest. The systems might have provided the information, but it took exceptional piloting skills to use that information to fly through mountain passes in zero visibility. As they climbed away from the mountains toward their cruising altitude, Sarah reflected on the day's accomplishments. They had proven that special operations forces could be inserted into previously inaccessible terrain using fixed-wing aircraft flying at extremely low altitudes. More importantly, they had demonstrated that such operations could be conducted even in marginal weather conditions. Kandahar approach. Viper 1-1 requesting clearance to land. Sarah transmitted as they approached their home base. Viper 1-1, Kandahar approach. Cleared for straight-in approach, runway 2-3. Welcome home. As they touched down at Kandahar Airfield, Sarah felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The mission had been a complete success, proving concepts that would change the way special operations were conducted in mountainous terrain. After shutdown, as the SEALs gathered their gear to disembark, Morrison approached the cockpit one final time. Major Chen, what you accomplished today was nothing short of remarkable. You've proven that missions we thought were impossible are actually achievable with the right pilot and the right aircraft. Sarah looked back at the SEAL commander, seeing genuine respect and admiration in his eyes. Thank you, Commander. It's been an honor flying with your team. The honor was ours, Rodriguez interjected. You've changed how we think about what's possible in special operations aviation. Tank nodded in agreement. Major, when we brief this mission to command, you're going to have every special operations unit in the theater requesting you as their pilot. 3 weeks later, Sarah found herself in a briefing room at Special Operations Command, presenting the results of the mission to a room full of generals and senior officers. The success of the low-altitude insertion had indeed changed everything, just as Morrison had predicted. The mission proved that A-10 aircraft can successfully insert special operations forces into terrain previously considered inaccessible. Sarah explained to the assembled officers. The combination of the aircraft's low-speed handling characteristics and advanced navigation systems makes it uniquely suited for this type of operation. General Patricia Williams, the commander of Special Operations Forces in Afghanistan, leaned forward in her chair. Major Chen, based on your experience with this mission, What would you estimate as the operational limitations for this type of insertion? Ma'am, weather is the primary limiting factor. We can operate in marginal conditions using instruments and radar, but severe weather would ground any aircraft. Beyond that, the technique is limited by terrain features and enemy air defense capabilities. What about pilot training requirements? Asked Colonel Harrison, Sarah's former instructor pilot who had flown in specifically for the briefing. This isn't the kind of flying we teach in basic A-10 training. You're absolutely right, sir. This type of mission requires extensive additional training in low-level flight and instrument procedures. I would estimate at least 6 months of specialized training to certify pilots for these operations. The questions continued for over an hour, covering every aspect of the mission, from fuel requirements to emergency procedures. When the briefing finally concluded, General Williams asked Sarah to remain behind. Major, I want you to know that your accomplishments on this mission have not gone unnoticed. You've proven capabilities that will save lives and improve mission effectiveness across our entire command. Sarah felt a surge of pride at the recognition. Thank you, ma'am. It's been an honor to contribute to Special Operations effectiveness. More than that, General Williams continued, you've proven that excellence knows no boundaries. The skepticism you faced from those SEALs initially wasn't about your gender. It was about the mission seeming impossible. You turned skeptics into believers through professional competence and exceptional skill. 6 months later, Sarah found herself leading the newly formed Special Operations Aviation Training Unit, teaching other pilots the techniques she had developed for low-altitude mountain flying. The unit had already trained 12 pilots and supported over 30 special operations missions in terrain that had previously been inaccessible. The morning briefings now included mission profiles that would have been considered fantasy just a year earlier. Special operations forces were being inserted into mountain valleys throughout Afghanistan, dramatically expanding their reach and effectiveness. Enemy forces found themselves under pressure in areas they had considered safe havens. Standing in front of her latest class of student pilots, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her here. What had started as a single mission to prove a concept had evolved into a fundamental change in how special operations were conducted. The key to success in special operations aviation, Sarah told her students, is understanding that impossible is just another word for untested. With proper training, the right equipment, and unwavering professionalism, you can accomplish things that others believe cannot be done. As her students filed out to begin their practical flying exercises, Sarah looked out the window at the A-10 lined up on the flight line. Each aircraft represented the potential to take special operations forces where they had never gone before, to complete missions that had previously been impossible. The SEALs had sworn it was impossible to fly that low through mountain terrain. But sometimes, the impossible just needed the right person to prove it was actually inevitable. Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest at the recognition from these elite warriors. She had set out to prove that the mission was possible. But somewhere along the way, it had become about proving herself worthy of their respect and trust. It's been my pleasure, gentlemen, Sarah replied. Now go do whatever special operations magic you came here to do. I'll be waiting when you're ready for extraction. As the SEALs disappeared into the Afghan landscape, Sarah began planning for the equally challenging return flight. The mission had been a success so far, but they weren't home yet, or deflection, and the crisis developing around them was too serious for games of concealment. With trembling hands, Sarah reached beneath her jumper and pulled out the Navy and Marine Corps medal, the ribbon bright against the dark fabric of her uniform. Admiral Reyes's expression did not change, but Sarah saw something flicker in her eyes. Understanding, perhaps, or recognition of the burden that the medal represented. Now, Admiral Reyes said quietly, let's discuss why you've been hiding this, and why I think I'm going to need you to stop.